Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. Today I created a card using the brand new stamp set from Simon Says Stamp called Daisy Bouquets. I started out by first taking that large sentiment from the set and putting it in my Misti Tool, and I'm stamping that with Versafine Onyx black ink onto some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. I just recently started using the Versafine Onyx black ink, and I find that I really like it for stamping my sentiments. Next, I started stamping the floral images from the set around the sentiment, but this time I'm using Gina K Designs Jet Black Amalgam ink, and that's because I plan on coloring these in with my Copic markers, and I love this ink for any coloring. This card is actually quite simple. All I really did was stamp those images and then color them in, but the really big impact with this card is in the coloring. So like I said, I'm coloring this in with my Copic markers, and I do have all of the caps off to the side so that you can see all of the colors that I'm using. You'll see that for the different areas that I color, I have 3 different markers, and I start with my lightest color marker and work my way to my darkest color marker, and then I work the opposite direction back to my lightest color, and that helps to blend the colors together. Before I started coloring this, I did do quite a bit of planning so that I knew what colors I wanted to use, and I knew that they went really well together. So the first thing that I did in that planning process was to go to Pinterest and look up some pictures of daisies. And of course, when I first started looking, all of the daisies that I was seeing were white daisies because they seemed to be a little bit more common. But I really wanted my card to be very colorful, so I specifically searched for colorful daisies. One of the things that I was noticing with a lot of these daisies was that the color was deeper on the petals towards the center of the flower. So that is actually what inspired the way that I colored these flowers most of all. So when you watch me color a flower, you can see that I start with my lightest color and I start at the middle of the flower and I work my way towards the end of the petal, but I actually don't go all the way to the end when I first start out, and I leave some white there. Next, I take the medium shade marker and I add some shading towards the center of the flower, and then I add even more shading with the darkest color. I then start the blending process by going back to the medium shade, and then finally I end with that light shade, but this time I go all the way to the end of the petal, filling in all of that white space, and this really ensures that those ends stay nice and bright. The next step in my planning process was to figure out the actual colors of all of the flowers that I was going to be using. And I was seeing a lot of really pretty purple and kind of coral looking flowers when I was looking on Pinterest. So I decided to use those colors. After picking out my color scheme, the next thing that I had to figure out was which of my Copic markers were going to work for that color scheme. Now, I don't own a lot of Copic markers, but I can usually make them work, especially if I do some planning beforehand. So to plan out those colors, I took a piece of scrap paper and I stamped a few of these daisy flowers on that scrap paper, and then I started to pick out some colors and see how they worked on those flowers. I believe I colored in about 6 different test flowers, and out of those 6 flowers, I picked out 3 different combinations that I really liked for my card. Now, I totally could have just started coloring and skipped this whole planning process, and you might think that that would be quicker, but even taking all of that time to plan out this card probably saved me time in the long run, because once I started coloring, the coloring went by so fast because I knew exactly what I was going to do. And not only that, but I also had a really good idea of how it was going to look in the end, and I knew that it was going to look really good because these colors all worked really well together, and I had proved that in my testing. You might have noticed that a second ago I dropped one of my Copic markers and it landed on the paper so that I have this big pink smudge, but I'm going to fix that and I'll show you how I do that in a minute. For the stems, I picked out 3 different colors of green Copic markers, but I actually only ended up using 2 of them. I didn't use the YG67 because once I used the first 2 markers, I was pretty happy with it and I didn't think it needed that darker shade. Okay, so to fix that little smudge that happened, I took my colorless blender and I just kind of went over it and pushed it down towards that flower until it disappeared. Another thing that I noticed when I was looking at Pinterest was a lot of the daisies had these rings of bright spots around the centers, and I believe that they were more on the yellow side because I think that they were pollen, but I decided to kind of create those using a white gel pen and just adding some dots around the centers. I then took that white gel pen and I added some highlights on the petals of the flowers. But once I finished adding the highlights, I thought that they were a little bit too bright and I wanted to tone them down. So I took the lightest Copic marker that I used on each of the flowers and I went over those highlights, and that really worked on toning them down. Now this part was a little bit difficult for me because I always find it hard to cut a piece that I've done a lot of work coloring on, but I really wanted a border around the edge of this piece, so I cut it down to be 3 3/4 by 5. I used my ATG gun and I adhered this panel to a piece of Simon Says Stamp Midnight Green cardstock. I then took that entire panel and I put some foam tape on the back, and then I popped it up on an A2 size card base. I wanted to fill in some of the white space that I had along the edges, so I took one of the flower stamps from the set and I put it on an acrylic block, and I very carefully stamped where I needed to fill in those white spaces. In hindsight, I probably should have masked off my borders so that I didn't accidentally stamp on them, but luckily I didn't have a problem. So I stamped a few of those flowers along the edges and I colored them in, and then I moved on to adding my finishing touches. I used my tweezers and my Gina K Designs Connect glue to add some sequins to the card. The sequins that I used are the Simon Says Stamp Moonshine sequins and the white orchid sequins from Lucy's Cards. The last thing that I did to finish up this card is I took my Wink of Stella glitter brush and I very randomly added it to the petals on the flowers, not completely filling it in, just kind of adding enough for a hint of shine. And here's a closer look, and you can see that shine as I tilt it in the light. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design featuring that Daisy Bouquet stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. All of the supplies that I used for today's card can be found in the description down below. If this is your first time on my channel and you enjoyed watching, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that you can see all of my future videos. I do new card videos every single week, and I'm going to be back with another one really soon. Again, thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a good day today.